Hello, everybody. Welcome back to Futures Frame TV. I'm Alice Krozer, your host on the Inequalities channel. Today, I'm here with Hugo Cerón-Anaya, who is a sociology professor at Lehigh University in the US. Hey, Hugo, how are you doing?
Good. Thank you very much. I'm really excited about the invitation and the possibility to talk more about inequalities, the connection between race, class, gender in Latin America.
Yeah, thanks for being here with us and for telling us about these topics. These are your main subjects of research, and you're an outspoken expert on the relation between class and race and how they play out, specifically in Mexico, but in Latin America and in America probably more generally. You wrote a book recently that exactly plays on those terms, plays literally. It's called Privilege at Play.
Right.
Can you tell us a little bit what the book is about?
I started this project mainly looking at class. I was interested in understanding the upper classes in Mexico, the upper middle class and the upper class, trying to understand. My main concern was to look at how people express notions of class in a daily basis. So I was interested in the sort of the mechanisms that people use to make boundaries, to keep boundaries, to recreate boundaries, and so on. Because I found that most of the body of work on class was, on the one hand, missing that strata, and on the second, they were not elaborating on how exactly class boundaries operate on a daily basis. So that was my intention. So then I decided to focus on 3 highly exclusive golf clubs in Mexico City. I knew how much was the membership, and therefore I knew that I was not dealing with middle classes. Those members who were able to pay these membership fees were not part of the middle class. They were part of the upper middle or upper class. When I went there to do interviews, to hang out with folks, to ask questions about workers and so on, I realized that class was not, or the traditional, or even the most sophisticated class analysis that you can think of, this discussion of culture, capital, or different forms of capital, and so on. Even that discussion was not enough to explain what people were telling me to explain social inequalities. That discussion was not enough, or those concepts were not enough to explain how people thought of workers and why workers were poor. They were also expressing something about diet. They were expressing things about the inherent nature of workers, and why they were poor had to do something with the natural disposition. They're almost something like their spirit, as in essence. There was something in the essence. And then the traditional class narrative and analysis and concepts are not good enough to explain this type of narratives. And then I developed in the book the idea of the racialization of class, the way in which, unlike the United States, in Mexico, and I will argue also to some extent in Latin America, when people talk about race, it's never clear-cut color line as it is in the United States. People express notions about construction workers or peasants. And those words that never speak of specific colors, they come preloaded with colors. In the same way that when they talk about good-looking members of society, that as well, it doesn't include some color specification, but it comes preloaded with notions of who's good-looking and who's not, who's a construction worker and who's not. So in the book, I developed this idea to try to explain why people who are talking about class and simultaneously talking about race, or how race and class collide and hide behind each other when we are looking at this case. The book also brings the issue of gender, because I think that when we talk about inequalities, and there are multiple studies showing us how gender or poverty has a gender face. Women tend to be poorer than men all over the world. So in this case, I also explain how female members or the setup of the space and the organization of the clubs try to keep women through multiple small mechanisms, through distribution of playing time, through internal torments, among many other things, try to put women's down, but at the same time, how women, those highly privileged women, prefer most of the times not to engage in an open fight to try to rearrange the space because their own privilege in class and racial terms may be at play, and they would prefer to keep that rather than to truly develop gender-free, gender-inclusive environment.
This is very interesting in relation to your own position in this constellation, let's say, right? Because I know that you're not a particularly interested golf player, or you hadn't been before, and also you're not a member of the Mexico City or Mexican in general upper class as such. How did you get involved in this, and how did you perform in this space yourself?
There is indeed an issue of performance. Most of the pieces written on elites, not only in Mexico or Latin America, all over the world, bring the point that the issue of access is fundamental to develop this type of research. And if you're not part of the community, that's sort of one of the main barriers that researchers face when they are trying to do some analysis on elites. In this case, I was not a golfer, I'm not a golfer. I was not interested in the sport per se. I'm interested in the sport in relationship to issues of inequalities and so on. And with that, let me make the caveat that the book or the research is not an accusation of golf or golfers. I just claim that I'm making an analysis on this small space. And more likely, if I move to other sports of linked to the elite or other elite spaces, I will find very similar arguments, not the same, but similar arguments. So this is not an accusation. This is not blaming a group of individuals, because as a sociologist, I'm not blaming individuals, but trying to unearth structures of inequality. Going back to the point of how do I gain access, it was indeed an issue of performance. I also found that I was borrowing the term of doing gender. I was actually doing class. I sort of tried to appeal to the elements that I knew that people will use to make sense of me in class terms. At the time, I was a PhD student in a British institution, and then that was sort of one of the bridges that I used to develop rapport with interviewees. Talking about London, talking about Berlin, talking about Madrid was one of the ways in which they perceive me as someone similar. There's in the book, the last chapter is a methodological discussion, how to think about these issues. Are you engaged in an unethical work by not presenting that you're interested in the ways in which class operates? Or we need to rather think of different ethical understandings when we do research with powerful actors. And sort of I engage with, there's a methodological issue, which, by the way, is not new. Since the time in which the American Sociological Association developed the Code of Conduct in the late 50s, after some disasters conducted by sociologists, mainly exploiting marginal groups, prostitutes, homeless groups, etc., after really unethical, almost colonial relationship with poor groups, the code of conduct was developed. But at the beginning, people start pointing out, well, what about powerful people? We cannot use the same rules in terms of ethics to study the poor, those who have no money, no prestige, no status, very limited understanding about academia, than if we go and interview powerful politicians, powerful businessmen, powerful cultural brokers, among many others. So there's an engagement of that. But I mainly play with these elements that I knew that will let them think of me as someone similar. My British connection, the fact that I was living outside of London, etc., sort of make people perceive me as similar. Having said that, I also face moments in which mainly workers didn't know how to treat me. In several instances, workers in these highly exclusive clubs see me walking in the club, and they didn't know whether I was a worker or I was a member. And it was these sort of revealing moments in which the combination of class and race was coming to the surface, when I was pretty much dealing with workers who haven't seen me there before, but they couldn't risk themselves to treat me as a worker because if I was a new member, they will be fired. So it was a fascinating interaction.
What do you think, a little bit on this point that you have with the powerful opponent, let's say, or you're the person that you're interviewing is powerful, is probably more powerful than you are. What do you think is this special element of elite studies, and how do you deal with that as a researcher?
It was certainly both an issue that I need to develop trust and rapport by making these connections about my life as a British postgraduate student. But at the same time, you're right, the balance of power was all the time against me, or I was tilted in the direction of the interviewee. From the simple fact that I couldn't pay my expenses. Most of these spaces, money doesn't circulate. People sign the bill and that's it. So I couldn't sort of establish on equal foot when I was not even able to pay for my drinks, for my food, etc. That sort of immediately signed who was in charge and who was not. Most of the cases, organizing interviews was a huge amount of work, a time-consuming task. People were canceling at the last minute, and that required another 3 weeks of constant emails, phone calls to try to rearrange interviews. And there were moments, I recall an interview in which I asked a very important executive in a global corporation if we can talk, and he said, yes, let me finish the game today and we can talk. For those unfamiliar with golf, that means something between 4 or 5.5 hours later. Of course, I was very interested in talking with him, and I said, fine, I wait for you here. Then I spent the whole 4.5 hours talking with workers and just hanging around and observing. When he returned, he said, oh yeah, we're going to talk. We sat. He spoke for no more than a minute and a half. And then he said something in the light of, I'm sorry, I just recall that I need to do something else and we need to stop now. And then he moved to the next table and started chatting very lively with someone else. So that was also present. The fact that, yes, I may live there. Yes, I may be a researcher, but my status within the community was still pretty low. And that was something that I need to manage.
Why do you think people actually did want to talk to you? What is their agenda in talking to you?
I recall that someone early on in the process, someone told me, you will see that people will talk to you. And this was an interviewee, by the way. He said, you will see that people will talk to you if they think that you have something to offer. Otherwise, there's no point in talking with you. Later on, this specific person was interested in, he wanted to make a connection with the UK, with Britain, trying to import golf equipment. So I think that like later, after 2 hours, he started talking, well, are you interested in being my representative there? I need someone who go to and make phone calls. And that was, I think, his interest. But for other people, I think their interest was mainly, well, I think that it changes according to the individual. I recall one person who, after we have a conversation, he called a couple of his friends telling them, I have a British researcher, quote unquote. He used that term, a British researcher doing a really cool project. Do you want to talk to him? And I think that for some people, they read me as someone with cultural capital. And for some, that was entertaining, amusing enough to let me speak with their friends and so on. And in other cases, I think that it also depended on who put me in contact with them. And it was less so that they wanted to talk to me and more so that they are offering paying back a favor to a friend. I think that in many cases that was sort of the motive.
I think that's a very interesting point, because that's also something that I've observed a lot when speaking with people in higher social classes, that there's a very subtle relationship of power, right? And this plays also into the title of your book. And I wanted to ask you, what do you understand, or why do you think it's important to talk about privilege, and what does it mean?
You know, one of the things when I started, well, the whole research started moving from just a class analysis into a discussion of the combination of class, race, and gender, I would start thinking about the way in which some of these members talk about poor workers. When I ask them, why is it that those folks, despite working, are poor? What makes them poor? And then I start hearing these explanations that were based on privilege. So what I concluded is that over 90% of these members were unable to understand the decision of workers. For them, the decision to quit the possibility of the possibility to develop a professional career of some highly talented caddies was the best example to show there's nothing to do for these folks. They are lazy by nature. They have no ambition. They have nothing that is a waste of time and money to help them. When I start talking with caddies about the same issues, and when they start sort of revealing the constant struggle that it is if you are extremely talented but poor to move up, suddenly I think that the book and the frame help us to understand that in Latin America, we have been trying to fight against poverty for 80 years, 90 years, and we're almost in square one. If not, we're in square one. So I think that we need to change the focus. We need to start developing more sophisticated understandings of not only the poor, but also of those who analyze the poor, and what type of recipes, what type of policy recommendation, what type of ideas are they suggesting? Why? Because if we go back in time, we can go to these racialized arguments of hygiene and diet as a sort of solution to deal with the poor, which of course, those arguments were based on the privileged position of those developing the policy at the time. So to what extent, when we look at poverty, more so in terms of policy, shall we pay attention to those framing the issue rather than the poor themselves? Or to what extent we need to put both of them together?
Yeah, I think that's a very important point. I fully support that lens, right? That inequality is by nature a relationship between both extremes, right? And we have to understand both in order to deal with it. Hugo, do you want to add something that we can put in as a kind of maybe positive note after this very complex relationship of class, race, rich, poor, to round up the discussion?
I think in a positive note, I would like to think that we need to start having a conversation, and probably this conversation in Mexico and Latin America, but it will be similar if you think of other countries all around the world. We cannot use the categories developed in the West, the United States or Europe, to make sense of other settings. We need to develop our own categories of understanding the local reality. If I think of a positive note, I would think that I will encourage people to think about the local reality and how to reshape the tools, even from Marx, if you will, to Bourdieu or Foucault or any other classical thinker that you can think of. We need to start rethinking their tools to make sense to local realities. And I think that will be a highly positive element. In terms of policy, at the end, I didn't develop any policy recommendation in my book because I don't feel I'm not an expert on policy. So I think that I will move the book out of my strengths, and I prefer to sort of develop and suggest tools that will make sense, that's my argument, for this local context.
A very humble and yet very well-informed and excellent analysis and point you're taking in the book, and I mean in general in this interview as well. Thank you very much, Hugo, for sharing this great insights on the local realities here and the great work that we have ahead as researchers and I guess everybody living these realities, thinking about them, thinking about the concepts, rethinking them, maybe reshaping them, adjusting them. A lot to do for all of us ahead. Thank you for watching, and if you enjoyed this video, join us again for Futures Frame TV in our next interview. Thank you. I'm Krozer, your host on the Inequalities channel. Have a good afternoon. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much.